Welcome to the Business of Platforms, a video podcast series where Vivaldi will be chatting with the world's leading marketers, thinkers, and innovators about the evolution of business and the exciting ways in which platforms are helping companies and brands deliver greater value.
So welcome to the podcast, The Business of Platforms. I am Erich Joachimsthaler. I am extremely excited and pleased to be with Sangeet Choudary. Sangeet Choudary is one of the leading authors, thought leaders and consultants on platforms. I have to say a few things about Sangeet, if you don't mind. He is a C-level advisor, international best-selling author of 2 books, Platform Scale and Platform Revolution with Jeff Parker and Marshall van Alstyne. He's a Thinker 50. He is voted a young global leader by the World Economic Forum. And he's the youngest Thinker 50 in the world from India. Thank you for being with us, Sangeet.
Thank you, Eric. Thank you so much.
Sangeet, I didn't know where to start because the topic of platforms is so big in your life and it is in my life. So I went back to this 2013 article and said, if I talk to Sangeet, I'd like to know what happened in the last 5 years, what happens today, where is your head and your mind right now to the listeners. That would be an interesting thought. And where is the show going? And so when I read that article back in Wired magazine, Pipelines versus Platforms, I thought it was laying out very nicely the revolution that we have seen. Can you just, for the reader, simply explain what is pipelines, what is platforms from your point of view, and then how did you see what has happened in those years?
I started looking at platforms almost a decade back, and it's around 2012 that I started focusing all of my work towards understanding the platform economy. And when I started talking about platforms and explaining this to, frankly, executives from traditional industries, I realized that for them it was very difficult to wrap their heads around what exactly a platform was. And some would limit it to thinking of a marketplace like an Airbnb or Uber, and some would think about it as a technology platform. And so to kind of explain the fundamental shift that the platform economy was bringing, I came up with the metaphor of pipelines, which essentially means that traditional business in the industrial era used to work in a very linear model, and that is what I call a pipeline-based model, where you have factories or even services businesses creating goods and services, pushing it down a pipeline and taking it to the end consumer, and the consumer pays for that good or service using money. And we've kind of perfected that model on the back of mass production, mass media, which helps to convince the market, and on the back of supply chain optimization. So we understand pipelines very well. What's changed is that as the world gets more connected and as more of us participate on the internet, keep creating data, we've started seeing a new business model where the business no longer creates a product or the service and just ships it out to the end consumer. The business now connects external producers and consumers with each other and provides this common infrastructure and this common organizing mechanism through which these producers and consumers can exchange value with each other. And so instead of being the sole creator of value, and instead of owning the means of production, platforms essentially own the means of orchestration and organization of this ecosystem of producers and consumers. So that's essentially the difference between what used to happen and where we're headed. And this is why I used that metaphor. And the Wired article that you're referring to was the first time I wrote about this. It was very well received, and then I wrote about it in my 2 books and the HBR article after that. And that's really the idea of pipelines versus platforms.
Very interesting. In your book and in your article in the Harvard Business Review, you talk about a revolution. What is that revolution now?
Yeah, so to understand that, it's helpful to understand the way platforms have evolved, and actually to even understand the history of orchestration to some extent. So if you look at the pipeline world, orchestration, and whatever extent that it did happen, happened very contractually. You would orchestrate an entire value network or a loose network of supply chain actors through different forms of contracts. But it was still not fluid enough. The other form of orchestration was using standards. So Sony would create a standard, and the entire electronics industry would work around it. Or Intel created the PCI standard and the USB standard, and the software industry organized around it. But what we're seeing with platforms is that platforms orchestrate using other forms of organizational mechanisms, and one of the key mechanisms is using data. If you look at marketplaces, for example, if you look at Uber essentially orchestrates drivers and riders using data. It uses location data, it uses reputation data, and it uses route optimization data to determine which driver should be matched with which rider and what route they should be taking. So that's an example of how orchestration works with platforms. Now, when we think about platforms, what's changed over time is where we've started seeing the platform economy come up. So the parts of the traditional economy that we did not expect to move towards platforms have increasingly started being impacted by platforms. If we trace this back a bit, since when I first talked about it and to where we are today, back in 2013, when the Wired article was written, we were uh, in this phase when the big four, Facebook, Apple, Amazon, Google, were growing very rapidly. We had seen Airbnb and Uber grow very rapidly. So we saw B2C platforms coming up rapidly, and especially in specific industries, as far as
Technology.
it work with, yes, technology, media, communications, services. But we saw that happen in those specific industries. What's happened ever since then is that industries that were much more resistant to moving in this direction have also started moving towards platforms, and that's been driven by a few different factors. The first is that asset intensive industries like mining, metals, these industries have become increasingly digitized because of sensors, because of data that is being generated as the business processes move into the cloud in these industries. So traditional asset intensive B2B industries have started coming onto platforms.
Mhm.
The second thing that's happened is that highly regulated industries have started getting deregulated. And the best example for this is banking, especially if you look at the UK, Europe, and Australia. And in all these geographies, you see that banking has been deregulated, and banks now have to share data with third parties. And so banks have to embrace APIs. And when that starts happening, banking products start getting unbundled from the bank, and that creates opportunities for new platforms to reorganize these products and serve them to consumers. So we've started seeing deregulation as a second driver for this shift. And the third driver for this shift has been the emergence of new layers of interoperability. And what I mean by that is that Facebook, Apple, Google, Amazon came on top of the internet. The internet was the layer of interoperability.
Mhm.
But we don't have an internet for global trade. We don't have an internet for global medical data sharing. But what we've started seeing now is, with the rise of blockchain and distributed ledger technologies, these technologies are being used to create shared governance models, shared ownership models, through which you create an interoperability framework between different players within a certain industry ecosystem, and then allow new platforms to come up on top of that interoperability framework. So in a way, permission blockchains are creating the internet for trade or the internet for healthcare, and that's on top of that, we have started to see new platforms emerge. So it's a combination of these three things that's really changed over the last several years.
And goes beyond much beyond an industry as well. It doesn't have to be within the industry. I'm curious. What is your favorite example of a platform in like a heavy industry, let's say, or some more one of the complex B2B industries rather than the typical ones we hear?
Right. So there are quite a few initiatives underway in several industries. If we look at Maersk, Maersk is creating a platform in partnership with IBM in the container shipping industry that digitizes the events in the life cycle of a shipment. So
Yeah.
it digitizes the end-to-end shipping life cycle and then orchestrates various actors, port authorities, ship owners, all of them around that data. So that's an example of such a platform. Another example that I would give here is what's happening in the construction industry, where a company like Autodesk has really rich data around building design, and it can potentially orchestrate the entire building construction process around this data, and then link that with sensors and data feeds from the building to connect the design assumptions to the actual operations of the building. And so you have the potential to create this end-to-end construction orchestration platform using the Autodesk building design data.
Yeah.
And we're also seeing companies like GE, Siemens, Schneider Electric creating platforms for industry automation where the platform essentially gathers data from all the different machines across a production system, and it is able to orchestrate the entire production process much better, interface with external logistics systems much better. And so that's another example of such platform coming up.
What's sort of interesting is that you started out talking about pipelines and platforms, and you talk about your interest in business models. And when I think of business models, I think of freemium, I think of these one and done type things. You know, I adopt a business model, I adopt a let's say, a subscription business model. But when you talk about platforms, you're not really just talking about business models. It's you also, if I understood the answer, you sort of like say they are on the way. The Maersk is on the way. So there is a lot more to come. This is just the beginning. Or do you see this as a here's a perfect example, a perfect model that now others can sort of learn from, or is this all still work in progress?
If you look at traditional industries, and if you're not talking about the large platforms that we've already seen elsewhere, a lot of the traditional industry platforms have kind of emerged over the last 5 years. So we have examples like John Deere, we have examples like GE that have kind of gone down this path over the last 5 years, but they've they have not created the kind of business value that has been created in the consumer industries for the variety of reasons. In consumer industries, it's much faster to create network effects because there are fewer barriers to network creation, and use cases are much more homogeneous across different geographies and different regulatory paradigms. In traditional industries, it's much more difficult to make that happen, and it's a combination of the complexity of the network effect as well as the fact that really the first step towards digitizing these industries happened only over the last 5 years, that we see more of works in progress at this point, but we already see a lot of value being unlocked. I would think of this as value can be unlocked in a platform economy at three levels. You can unlock value by pure digitization, which we're seeing across the board, whether you're building platforms or not. At the second level is you can unlock value with the data that you collect and manage as an asset. So you still don't manage an ecosystem, but you manage the data as an asset and you create business models around that data. A lot of value has been created with that, whether it's through analytics, through machine learning products, or whether it is just through providing better targeting capabilities. And finally, the third layer of value is when you start unlocking new interactions in the ecosystem because you've created that level of intelligence and transparency about ecosystem actors and their actions. That is what is still a work in progress in a lot of these industries. So I just want to qualify that in that model.
Yeah, for example, if you think John Deere, I read that only 5,000 farmers have now shared some data. Until that's 5,000 farmers of what, 100,000 or hundreds of thousands of farmers. So it covers only a very small number of hectares, if you will, of land. What if I mean, that it must be sort of way at the beginning stages. What if John Deere and has, as you said, your third point, has been able to use the data, use analytics, use those data, and actually share them with crop manufacturers and seed manufacturers, rather than just optimizing, wandering or driving down with certain precision with a certain tractor and combine down the field. So I think that it's still, I mean, I think it's a good example, John Deere perhaps, of where there is already value unlocked, to your point, but the potentiality is actually gigantic or huge.
Right. I think, John Deere, GE, these are all good examples of platforms that have reached the data as an asset phase rather than the ecosystem orchestration phase fully. And that is where, that is the leap that a lot of these traditional industry platforms have to make.
Yes. I'd be curious. Is that so? I'd be curious. I was at one of your talks in Berlin on platform economy, the Platform Economy Summit. It was called, in Berlin, and I wanted to touch on a few things that you mentioned there, and perhaps you can explain it. One thing you said is there are new forms of digitalization: consumption, identity, location, reputation, machine performance, and business processes. Can you talk to this a bit to us?
Right. What I was essentially talking about is that the impact or the extent to which the platforms the platform economy has taken over has been driven by the digitization of specific elements that were required to make these platforms useful. And essentially, when we trace back this history, we see that digitization of consumer data, first by companies like Amazon and Netflix, where they were able to digitize consumer data and figure what consumers actually wanted. That created new kinds of opportunities, not just in terms of personalization, but also in terms of anticipating what consumers needed before they even knew that they needed it. And Amazon's latest one of the recent patents is around anticipatory shipping, where it anticipates and ships something to you even before you need it. And they've just started piloting that with brands, allowing them to send samples to consumers. And so what that shows us that when we digitized consumer data, we started creating new kinds of interactions to the consumer. The next key element that got digitized was identity. And this happened when Facebook started insisting that you have to use your university email address or your corporate email address to have a Facebook account. In that process, it started digitizing identity of people, and then it took that identity out of its walled garden and put it out in the open for third parties to use in the form of Facebook Connect. And when it did that around 2008, that's when we started seeing an explosion in platforms that allowed real world interactions between people, like Uber, Airbnb, because identity was critical to providing to creating that trust for real world interactions. And then we saw the digitization of location because of two factors in particular. One was that smartphones started becoming pervasive 2007 onwards, and around that time Google had acquired Keyhole and created Google Maps. And a combination of strong mapping data and the ubiquitous smartphone allowed the digitization of location, which is why we started seeing location-based services come up. And then as we move towards other parts of the economy, we see digitization of the reputation of workers help to create labor platforms. Digitization of machine performance help to create industrial platforms. And now if we look at examples like Maersk, digitization of business processes, of B2B life cycles is essentially creating the next generation of platforms. So the argument essentially is that if you follow the technologies that are driving digitization and extracting value out of that digitization, you start seeing where platforms are going to come up next, which industry, and at what point in time. And that's what we've really seen over the last several years.
No, very interesting. You also mentioned something, I'd be curious, and I read one of your last, your year-end reviews and looking forward reviews. You talk about countries as platforms. Can you talk to that?
Right, that's been a big theme in my work over the last year or so. I've worked with several countries in terms of thinking about what a platform strategy means for them. And the idea essentially is that um, countries participate in a connected world. They always have. And countries participate in a connected world. They always have. And it is this the fact that that most countries actually participate on networks, whether it is trade networks, whether it is flows of people and labor, or whether it is flows of capital. If you look at countries like Switzerland, they've always been at the hub of flows of capital. Countries like Singapore have been a hub of flows of trade. And so, as the world gets more connected, we're also starting to see flows of data. And so, what we've always seen geopolitically is that when you attract flows in your direction, you become more competitive. Switzerland, Singapore, Hong Kong, all of these are examples of these strategies. Netherlands, um, and so on. And if we take that to the platform economy, if you attract data in your direction, you're going to become much more competitive, purely because you'll have the data sets to train your algorithms. And as your algorithms learn more and build better learning models, you will be best positioned to understand future data flows. And with that in mind, I proposed a framework for how Singapore as a country could become a platform where, as more and more trade moves towards digital trade, there's a concern that Singapore will lose its position as being a physical trade hub. And The idea there is that as more trade moves to digital trade, um, a country like Singapore could launch an SME trade platform to allow other countries to manage their SME trade. And Singapore has already launched this platform within Singapore for SMEs within Singapore. The idea is that once you start launching it to other countries, they use it to have their small businesses scale by uh, being part of the central platform. And the way Singapore provides value to these other countries is because it, by virtue of having the best fintech, which it has attracted through regulatory arbitrage over time, by virtue of having the best fintech, it can attract the data flows of these SMEs back and provide them much better trade financing and insurance that the traditional banking industry in those target countries will not be able to provide. And through this, just like Switzerland attracted capital flows and Singapore attracted trade flows, this strategy helps you attract data flows in your direction. And so, trade is only one example of how you attract data flows back. India is doing this with financial inclusion by training its algorithms on a billion people and then trying to take that to other countries. And China potentially is trying to do this same thing with the Belt and Road Initiative. And there are many other examples of countries in Europe also thinking about this. So that's the idea of country as a platform.
Now, that in a way, it almost means that when you apply platform thinking the way you do to countries, it also means that size of the country is irrelevant because it is, in a way, it's sort of like the asset itself, meaning what we used to say, the resources, the infrastructure and all of that isn't really anymore the driver of competitiveness of that country. It goes way beyond.
That's right. It's similar to what we see in industry, where you have small startups coming up and disrupting really large asset heavy incumbents. We're starting to see something similar in the sense that countries that are able to attract data flows will potentially be able to be more competitive than countries who have the resources but do not have the data to make intelligent utilization of these resources.
Yeah.
And that's really what we're going to start seeing. And we're kind of in the first phase of that, where more and more countries realize this, and the small countries around the world are using regulatory arbitrage to attract technology and IP in their direction. And you just need to look at how countries like Dubai, Switzerland, Singapore, New Zealand have changed their regulation to support IP registration and IP residency over the last 3 years to realize that this is a very clear part of their strategy. They realize that in a platform economy, you need to have the IP with you in order to eventually attract the data in your direction.
Yeah. Now I have one country that actually is way ahead of everything, and I'd be curious your about your reaction. The country I think about is Alibaba. I call it a country now because I look at it what they did in China. These hundreds of thousands of merchants who didn't have any electronics, even a Wi-Fi, and they built basically the infrastructure, a data infrastructure, as you well know. And then I learned now that they have also entered Southeast Asia. Then they have now in Africa they have entered Rwanda. I think is a hot spot there, and also in Europe now in Belgium somewhere. And in a way, isn't what you propose for countries, in a way, what Alibaba is doing as sort of their global strategy of platformization?
Yeah, so Alibaba is very interesting in the sense that it's a classic it's a classic example of a company that has completely transformed its strategy, and its global strategy has nothing to do with its China strategy, except that it built its capabilities while executing its China strategy. And what Alibaba is doing, it's very interesting to note the various pieces of the puzzle. So piece number one of the puzzle, one of the simplest pieces is that Alibaba is using its payments network, Alipay, which is part of Ant Financial now. They're using that as the beachhead to enter non-Asian markets, particularly Europe. And the way they enter that is by telling merchants in Europe that you have this huge stream of Chinese tourists coming over, who do not use credit cards, but who all of whom you use Alipay, and this is the way you can tap into this huge market. So they're kind of piggybacking this growth in Chinese tourism. That's part one of their strategy. Part two is more of a country level strategy, which they are executing in Rwanda in Africa, but also in several parts of Southeast Asia.
Yeah.
And they've also signed MOUs with the UN to improve financial infrastructure in Africa. But in all of these things, what they're doing is they're providing a trade platform very similar to the Singapore strategy I talked about, but with the idea that the financing would eventually be done using Ant Financial, and that helps to attract data flows in their direction eventually. So that's part two of their strategy, if you think of it. Part three of their strategy is built around what is called the Alibaba Cloud. It's called Aliyun. So it's like Amazon Web Services, but Alibaba's model. Unlike Amazon Web Services, what they're doing with that is very interesting. What Alibaba is doing is quietly trying to create a global payments fabric. I don't even call it a payments network, because people call PayPal a payments network, but you have to have PayPal to be able to use PayPal. What Alibaba is doing is it's investing in all the top payments players in these target countries: Brazil, Indonesia, India, all over the world. And it's with the investment comes the requirement that you build your business on top of the Alibaba Cloud. And that makes the Alibaba Cloud the backend payments fabric, because all the payments data is being processed through the Alibaba Cloud, eventually allowing to create that interoperability layer that I talked about, which does not exist in global payments today. And this, I believe, is the strongest part of their strategy, because the other part of it, I'll call this 3A. 3B is to take the Alibaba Cloud and take it to banks in all of these countries which have not been digitally transformed yet, and provide them a bank in a box and say, if you come on to Alibaba Cloud and run your bank over here, we make it much easier for you to run the bank. And so the payments fabric now does not simply have the wallets, digital wallets in each country, but also the banks in all of these countries. And we've seen the first few banks in China coming onto the Alibaba Cloud, and I expect that will happen even more as they move forward. So there's a very intelligent, multi-step strategy that they're executing across the trade platform, the payments fabric, and riding on Chinese consumers going to Europe, all of which are working together to help their global expansion.
And what I read just now is about this EWTP. It's called this World Trade Platform. Yeah. And what it does is it almost it creates this commerce capability of 24 hours or 72 hours globally, and it sort of creates an interoperability, or this ecosystem, if you will, which brings every merchant, every small business, every German medium-sized business, let's say in Germany, brings them into the world economy in some ways on this platform, which is all basically, I call it a country because it is basically, the mechanism of how a country runs, the Alibaba country.
Right.
I'm curious, what's on your mind? You are one of the most wonderful and brilliant thinkers on platforms. I'd be curious, sort of, where is your head? Maybe that'd be curious to hear from you.
In terms of where things are headed, and not just because it's the beginning of a year, but just because of the interesting phase in which we are right now, I think there are a few themes that I'm looking at particularly, and that I believe will become even more important going forward. One theme is that I'm closely watching and looking at is how platform regulation plays out, because a lot of platforms have kind of mushroomed in the Wild West without being properly regulated, and the regulators are now catching up. And so we'll have to see what kind of business models get weakened, which kinds get strengthened because of regulation. If you look at fintech and the deregulation of the financial industry, regulation is actually helping a lot of platform companies. But in certain other places, it may be working against innovation. So that's an important aspect that I'm looking at, and also helping inform, working with key stakeholders in regulating these platforms. The second piece that's important is looking at the larger scale effects of the platform economy. I did a lot of this last year, looking at, first of all, how the platform economy helps or harms the labor force in a particular country. And did some work with the ILO on that. Did some other work with the UN on how platforms impact the creative industry in a particular country. And there's been a lot of talk about Kenya as a country resisting Netflix coming in because of how it would impact the traditional creative industry. And increasingly, as we see the impact of technology companies and platforms becoming stronger, we start realizing that there are largest systemic effects that play out at the social and socioeconomic level. And so I'll be looking at more things beyond just workforce and the creative industries. So that's another important theme. A third important theme is around country as a platform, just because I see a lot of work happening in that direction, a lot of work that I'm involved with. I believe this is going to be an important theme, whether we call it country as a platform or whether we call it an AI arms race, or fundamentally it is about the fact that we're in a connected data rich world, and countries have to think about that to stay competitive rather than think about resource hoarding and talent hoarding only. And so that becomes a third really important theme. And a fourth and final theme that I think we all need to be very very focused on is essentially looking at how traditional industries will see commoditization and competition. And what I mean by that is that when platforms come into a certain industry, they increase competition at all other layers of the value chain except the layers that they want to play in. And in doing so, they start commoditizing all of these layers. When Facebook and Google came in, they commoditized content. And because of that, media companies got heavily impacted. When Apple and Google came into telecom, they commoditized what would be called over-the-top services, and that is where telecom companies lost a lot of the revenues. So as we see this happening in trade, in finance, and healthcare, what we need to think about is where will commoditization happen and where will the profit pools move to? And this is what executives need to be really focused on. So these four things are really things that drive me on a daily basis, because this is where a lot of the important questions will be answered in the platform economy.
Oh my God, I should say, a journey from, let's get a car via Uber, let's say, or a spare room in a home of somebody through Airbnb, which is where almost the journey started so many years ago, to all of these issues that you just addressed. I hardly could summarize them as eloquently as you do. Sangeet, I'm so excited to be here with you. It's been a wonderful half an hour we had. I could go on forever, and I hope we see us very soon. I mean, the ideas that you brought forward, especially what you talked about, where things are going, the impact, the workers' impact, the societal impact, the changes of traditional industry, the commoditization, and where the profit pools are moving. It is literally something that has an impact that is far beyond what I think even I would have considered 5-7 years ago, and when I read your article first. Anyway, thank you so much for being with us, and again, I appreciate so much you are contributing to the podcast, The Business of Platform. I'm Erich Joachimsthaler, the CEO of Vivaldi, and I am with Sangeet Choudary, one of the most prolific thinkers in the platform business. Thanks again for being with us.